Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to Durham Cathedral. My name is Philip Plemming, and I serve as Dean of Durham, overseeing the life and mission of this wonderful and ancient place of worship and prayer. And this afternoon's discussion is part of the programme of the Durham Cathedral Institute. We have a distinguished panel of legal scholars to discuss the importance and legacy of Magna Carta. I'll introduce them more in a moment, but would you please welcome Professor Thom Brooks, Dr. Henry Jones, Dr. Ruth Houghton, and Dr. Ben Douglas. So to today's topic. Beginning in July this year, the Cathedral has been mounting an exhibition of our 3 copies of Magna Carta. We'll know that the Magna Carta was first issued in 1215. Well, this cathedral owns the only surviving copy of the 1216 Magna Carta, along with issues from 1225 and 1300. And it closes on the 2nd of November. If you haven't seen it yet, you'll get the chance to do today. Magna Carta, the Great Charter, has been described as the most famous document in English history and as a cornerstone of modern democracy. And it's therefore particularly fitting that we hear this afternoon from 4 legal scholars for whom the Magna Carta is a foundational document for today's national and international legal systems. Our first speaker is Professor Thom Brooks. Thom is Professor of Law, Ethics and Government in the Durham Law School and Principal of Collingwood College. He is an internationally recognised legal scholar and policy expert whose work has transformed UK immigration policy. Through his research, his public engagement and advisory roles, he has shaped national debates and influenced government policy. He's one of the most influential advisors to the present Labour government. And so will you please welcome Professor Thom Brooks.
Well, hello, everyone. Firstly, my thanks to the Dean of the Cathedral for the kind invitation to do this panel. I warmly recommend the terrific exhibition, if you haven't seen it already, in displays in the Cathedral about the Magna Carta, a document with enormous historical, philosophical, and symbolic significance. And I'm only going to say a few kind of general remarks right now about it. This great charter is something most have heard of, but even fewer know much about its contents or recall the rights that it enshrined or why it's significant. You can tell from my accent, perhaps, that I'm American. And there was a very famous interview on a very famous late night talk show with David Letterman, who is from my home state of Connecticut, where he interviewed a guy called David Cameron, who was then Prime Minister, and said, Prime Minister, can I ask you some questions from the UK citizenship test? And one of those questions was, what does the Magna Carta stand for? What does it mean? To which the Prime Minister safely said, well, I don't remember, I don't recall. A bit embarrassing. So the Great Charter. So this is a question that has stumped even former Prime Ministers as to what exactly makes it so great and the charter that it is. Originally sealed by King John at Runnymede in 1215, it introduced a set of principles that bound even the king himself. It introduced this concept of the rule of law, one of our shared British values, an essential legal idea that all are bound to the law, with nobody, even a king or queen, exempt from the law. Now, up until this time, the more common concept was this idea of a divine right of kings, the idea that the king had authority from the divine, and that you did what the king said as a kind of divine authority on earth. The king was, in that sense, above the rest of us in terms of the law. They could exempt themselves, so to speak, from their regulations. But the Magna Carta was different. Magna Carta introduced this idea between barons and the king, originally, but the king was not exempt. The king was to follow the rules as well. And this kind of general precept amongst a small group on that day in Runnymede is something that has gone from a concept and idea happening to basically resolve a conflict between two sides at that time, to something that's a concept that you now see played out in countries all over the world, north and south, east and west. This idea of the rule of law is something that we often might take for granted, but it's something that we see kind of originally enshrined. Its initial flowering in this Magna Carta that we have here today. And so while we take for granted the idea that rules apply to all equally, not quite what Magna Carta was at the time, applying then to the barons and the king, and that no one should be above that law, this widely influential idea is something that, this British idea, this thing that originated in Britain, is something that has been kind of embraced as our own in the United States and other countries as well, and something I think a great legacy of that great charter. Now, while it was originally an agreement between a small group, the ideas and rights and freedoms that were agreed, that bound the king at that time, are things that have had a wider application since then. So this idea of all equal before the law of a few became all equal before the law for all. And there were other ideas as well. Other fundamental rights and freedoms flowed from that too. The idea that we are all owed a fair trial before we are convicted, before we are in prison, is one that we see in the Magna Carta. The idea that that fair trial would be one with a jury of one's peers setting out whether or not, they, as the decision makers, whether one was guilty or innocent, is something we see there as well. The idea that the demos, that others are equals, those of us who are equal in our community, this democratic origins of an idea, of democratic control, are things as well we see there in its kind of first place. And so while when you go to the nitty-gritty looking at things between seemingly a small group in 2015, the original ideas enshrined about fair trial, about conviction, about the juries, about democratic control, about rule of law, are ideas that have since have gone from a small group at that time to something that's come across this country overall and things that's been exported around the world. Now, many countries have an idea of a founding document of some kind, an original contract of some sorts. And you see this in various ways in terms of, in philosophy, you have the idea of the social contract in Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the idea that you and I are bound by things because we consent to some kind of agreement. We see historical examples of a kind of this in the example of the United States Constitution, setting out things that bind all in a document that you can point to and you can see. And of course, the UK is a different kind of place where there's been different types of agreement. As I've come to see as a foreigner, I'm British now. I'm allowed to be here. Just to kind of be clear about this, I'm a British national after all these years. But as a foreigner to this land, it's been odd seeing the different types of things that have arisen. What does it mean to have an unwritten constitution in a place where there's, so then how do you point to what is that glue that brings us together? And this is a kind of a thing going back to 1215 and afterwards, because in medieval times you had different laws in Wales, you had different laws in Scotland, you had some different laws in Northumbria. Northumbria was governed by a civil code, like in continental Europe. It wasn't common law originally. And the Magna Carta wasn't just something setting out essential freedoms, which is important in its own right, but it was also this kind of fundamental glue, in a way, that connected peoples and lands, both across what we now call England, but also all parts of what has become Great Britain. Now, another important thing, so we've heard the dean say that there's different versions of the Magna Carta. I want to say something very quick about that before wrapping up. The Magna Carta, perhaps obviously, but maybe not obvious, easy to overlook, there wasn't a printing press then running off copies of the Magna Carta, right? So you had, under the auspices of whoever was the king at that time, folks issuing handwritten copies of these different and these were different versions from time to time and from year to year, with slight different amendments of different Magna Cartas over time. So there's different versions of it from time to time. What the 1215 says is not what the 1300 says. What's interesting here, of course, historically, if you go and look at the collections, is that the only surviving copy of the 1216 version is here. So you can see that first slight amendment of what this is here, issued under King Henry the Second. And then the 1225, the more definitive Magna Carta that was done many years later when he came of age. And then finally, we have the 1300 under King Henry the First, was kind of the last of the issuings of these Magna Carta. So what's interesting historically when you see these things is not just how this idea of habeas corpus, the idea of rule of law, the idea of fair trial, the idea of democratic control, having certain changes over time, but you basically have the beginning and the end of this period of Magna Cartas here in this cathedral. So I just offer some general remarks. I hand over to my colleagues. It's wonderful to be here. I look forward to seeing any questions people have, and thank you for coming today. Thank you.
Thank you, Thom. Our next speaker, Dr. Henry Jones, is Associate Professor of Law in Durham Law School. He's an expert in international law, particularly ideas of trade, property, and morality. In the contemporary context of a global refugee crisis, a global financial crisis, and the hardening of borders around the developed world, his research investigates the origins of international bordering and space demarcation. Will you please welcome our second speaker, Dr. Henry Jones.
Thank you. Good afternoon. And thank you to the organisers. Thank you to everyone for being here. As we said, I'm a legal historian, and I should say that my interests in the sort of history of international law take me back to very domestic and English property law origins. So that's my basis of what I'm going to try to say today, is to think a little bit about the world that Magna Carta came from, and to highlight some other aspects of it that are sometimes forgotten or not as well remembered. So taking us back to the 13th century, the majority of people then were peasantry, mostly in the position of being serfs. Being a serf was better than being a slave under Roman rule, but it wasn't what we would understand as freedom. Serfs were tied to specific land. They worked for a specific lord to whom they had to provide services and services on the land and the produce of the land. But they also had entitlements against that lord, entitlements to housing, entitlements to food, fuel, and everything required for subsistence living. These things were owned in common, shared equally and sustainably amongst the community. So a type of freedom, but a very different type of freedom to what we would think of. The other thing to keep in mind in the 13th century is the absolute authority of the church. The real law that affected normal people's everyday lives was religious law. Yes, there was common law and there were traveling judges and there was the king's bench, but these things were not what defined your everyday life, how to live, how to relate to other people, what to eat, what feasts to observe, etc., how to pray. This was the material of everyday life. And that means that political movements, radical political movements, the movements for change at that time, were also in the language of religion. They were heretical, they were heretics. Heretical groups at this time preached things like sharing all the resources of the earth in common amongst everyone, that the priests and the church should not be wealthy, that they shouldn't own lands, that they shouldn't hold things for themselves, and that they shouldn't be selling their services of confession and prayers and indulgences. These heretical groups also practiced far greater equality for women, greater freedom around sex, reproduction, and contraception. So that's the low level, that's the common people. At the level of government, the UK didn't exist yet in 1215. We're talking about, when we talk of King John, the King of England, the Lord of Ireland, and the holder of certain French territories. John had a difficult time as king, particularly in his relationship with Pope Innocent III, whose rule coincided with his almost exactly. John had stayed out of the Fourth Crusade in 1202 to 1204, promising to send money to support it instead. He fought again with the Pope over the imposition from Rome of the Archbishop of Canterbury against John's personal choice in 1208. Meanwhile, at this time, John was at war with the King of France, Philip II, and lost significant lands in those struggles. Philip had led the Fourth Crusade, and he needed to recoup the costs of that effort, and he largely recouped them by taking land off the English king, including Normandy, the traditional homeland of English kings up to that point since the Norman conquest. So John had been fighting for years to try and regain that territory, incurring further territorial and financial losses. So the English crown's resources are severely drained, and John had been trying to raise money by increasing taxes on his barons, declaring huge amounts of English woodland to be royal forests, and by the selling off of wards, maids, and widows into marriage. In early 1215, John reconciled with the Pope, declared himself a crusader, and that he was preparing to participate or lead a fifth crusade. This made it against religious law for Philip to continue to wage war against John. But it also created another need for John to raise money. So all of these pressures on raising money and these actions being taken against the barons meant that by April 2015, a group of rebellious barons from the north and east of England marched south and occupied London. In May, they demanded that John reissue the Charter of Liberties that had been issued by his grandfather Henry I, with some amendments which were authored by the Archbishop of Canterbury. This Charter of Liberties was signed in 1215. In September, the Pope annulled the charter, suspended the Archbishop, excommunicated the barons, and declared the whole thing to be a heresy. Civil war broke out. John died in 1216, officially of dysentery, but always rumoured to have been poisoned. And the guardians of his infant son, Henry III, reissued the 1216 charter. So why did that come to the north? Why is that in Durham? Well, England at that time is operating under a feudal structure, a pyramid with the king at the top, a level of barons, all the way down to the peasantry that it started with. In theory, that's how it worked. In practice, it's difficult to maintain order over a large territory in 1215. So powers almost equivalent to those of the king were handed out to certain rulers over certain areas. These were known as county palatinates. The most important palatinates were Chester, Lancaster, and Durham, all border areas of England. Durham's prince-bishops had their own legal system, their own courts. They didn't send members to parliament. They set their own taxes, and they had powers to raise their own armies. Lands north of the Tees are not recorded in the Domesday Book. Some of these palatinate powers continued up until the 1970s. Copies of the charter were sent to all cathedrals to be read out. 1215 was probably denounced before it made it to Durham, but 1216 did. In 1217, the charter was issued again, another peace settlement with barons, this time with a second charter accompanying it, the Charter of the Forest, and it then became known as Magna Carta, possibly to distinguish the big one from the small one, but also they're sometimes referred to as the Great Charter of Liberties, and the two of them regarded as together. And that's the other document that's in the collection there, is the Charter of the Forest alongside what we know of as Magna Carta. So Thom's already outlined some of the famous parts of Magna Carta that we know about, related to civil and political rights, the freedom of the church, the prohibition of illegal imprisonment, the right to trial by one's peers. But I want to finish by drawing out a few other elements of the Charter that tell a slightly different story about what the world was like in 1215. I want to focus on the material rights in the Charter, what we might call economic and social rights. So first, the Magna Carta might be a surprising place for us to find women's rights. But chapters 7 and 8 of the original charter guarantee that widows are entitled to their inheritance and that they cannot be forced to marry against their will. In modern English law, married women didn't get such guarantees of property rights until the late 19th century, and the marriage bar in this country wasn't made completely illegal until 1975. A second set of material interests can be found in the resetting of standard weights and measures, so Magna Carta protecting fair trade. The Charter also includes provisions for the protections of the rights of merchants to travel in and out of the country free of harassment. It talks about the removal of fish weirs from all navigable rivers. And it talks about the rights of citizens to return to the country, or subjects to return to the country after they leave it without harassment. The removal of fish weirs might sound like something very medieval, but what a fish weir did was it kept fish in a certain area so that the owner of the bank had the sole ownership of those fish, whereas fish was supposed to be a common food resource for everyone. Also, a fish weir blocks a ship from being able to sail up a river. So it's an interference with the freedom of movement. So that's my second big right that we'd be surprised to find in Magna Carta, protecting freedom of movement. And then the protecting of that common food resource is the third and highly significant set of economic rights that are found, particularly as we bring in the Forest Charter. John had declared great swathes of woodland to be royal forest, and also pastures. Forest meant that it belonged to the king rather than it just meant covered by trees. In the Charter, he and his successors promised to return those lands and to protect them for the people. The forest was a vital resource in the 13th century. Wood was a primary source of energy, it was used for heat, it was used for light, it was a primary building material, footwear was made from wood, plough handles, other farming equipment, and even to reinforce roadways. The woods were also an excellent source of food, both foraged and hunted. Medieval woodlands were carefully managed communal resources, and by taking them into royal control, the king had deprived the people in general, and the peasantry in particular, of a vital resource. So we're also in a period where the wool trade is growing, and wool was the miracle cloth of the Middle Ages. It kept you warm even when you were wet. By enclosing land and turning it into pasture rather than leaving it as woodland, this was increasing profits for fewer people, but depriving the majority of their basic rights. The Forest Charter details these protections and the resources of the woodland. The first article protects all existing commons and demands that anything recently enforested be returned to commons. The 7th article forbids the taking of food or animals in lieu of payment of tax. The 9th gives rights to grazing animals, allowing pigs to forage and for freemen to take food. The 13th protects the right to gather honey. The 14th says that road taxes can only be charged on those with carts, not those on foot. Taken together with this emphasis, the two charters protect a form of life, a material culture where individuals had direct rights to the means of subsistence. This is not to romanticize feudalism, but to say that if we're trying to tell a story of ancient rights, let's also look at the ones we lost. The common people of England at this time wanted to protect their rights over the land, to prevent enclosure and privatization, and they wanted to live freely.
Henry, thank you so much. Our third lecturer is Dr. Ruth Houghton. She is a senior lecturer in law at Newcastle University. She's an expert in global constitutionalism, that is, the application of the rule of law and human rights in the global realm, not just within nations. In her work on feminist constitutionalism and international law, Ruth uses feminist methodologies and constitutional and political theory to challenge widespread assumptions concerning democracy and constituent power. Please welcome our speaker, Dr. Ruth Houghton.
Thank you very much, everyone, for being here today, and thank you to the organisers. So I want to speak to you today about the cultural significance of the Charter. As we've heard from Henry Jones, Magna Carta is not just one document, but rather a series of documents that have been reiterated over time, and curiously lost at different points in history, only to be subsequently rediscovered at different points in time. Now, it's this rediscovery of the Charter and the stories that we tell ourselves about it, the images we create about the Charter, that is something that interests me. We tell ourselves lots of stories about this Charter, and there are lots of myths that circulate about it, about what it includes and what it doesn't, the rule of law, trial by jury, how it came about in a field in Runnymede, somewhere outside London, extracted from a tyrant King John by his barons. And within constitutional history of England and Wales, and indeed around the world, these myths and stories and images arguably become more important than the very text of the Charter itself. So in particular, I want to tell you a story about culture, specifically about theatre productions and very nichely about Shakespeare plays. I want to talk to you about how those cultural significances help us to understand how the Charter got its constitutional significance. So to tell that story, we first need to ask ourselves, well, who was King John? King John might be better known to us as Prince John, the phony King of England, befriended only by a hissing snake tied up in chains at the end of Disney's animation of Robin Hood. Indeed, behind us here at the end of the cathedral hangs an image of John granting the Charter surrounded by his barons. As you leave today, I want you to have a look. Does that look to you like a tyrant being held accountable by his barons? Or does it look to you like a king who is benevolently granting those rights to his citizens? How we construct King John impacts the significance we place on Magna Carta. So I'm going to tell two stories specifically. One is about Tudor England and Shakespeare, and the second is about the 19th century when Shakespeare plays become most popular. If we go back then to the Tudors, I'm talking here about Henry VIII, Queen Elizabeth I. Why? Well, it's during this time that another great person of England, Shakespeare, is writing a series of history plays. Maybe Henry V, you might have heard of Richard II or Richard III, famous characters like Falstaff we all know about. Few of us will be familiar with the life and death of King John, written by Shakespeare in around the 1590s. Now, as we've said, we don't know that much as a modern audience about King John in our imagination. We know about Magna Carta and Robin Hood, neither of which make it into Shakespeare's play. So the Charter, the great Magna Carta, not even mentioned in this play by Shakespeare on the life and death of King John. Now, this has baffled historians and literary scholars alike. And so we might want to ask ourselves, why? Why is it missing? And there are a series of theories that historians have come up with as to why Shakespeare might have forgotten to mention Magna Carta. The first is he simply just didn't know about it. Remember I said we'd lost it. We'd forgotten about it. And so Shakespeare didn't know to mention Magna Carta in his play about King John. It was only rediscovered by Edward Coke in the 1600s when he needed to use it against King James I. The second theory as to why it's not there is that it would have just been too dangerous. Queen Elizabeth I is in a succession crisis as a result of the fact that she doesn't have an heir. It would have been seen to be risky for Shakespeare to demonstrate that there was this document that was going to hold the Queen accountable and to limit her power even further. The third theory is that it's just not a very good plot device. It's just not very interesting. So which of these theories best explains why the Charter isn't mentioned in the play? Well, what about that idea that he didn't know about it? Shakespeare was connected with the legal world of London at the time. We know for a fact that his plays have been performed in the Inns of Court, and we know from documentation that there are lecture series at the Inns of Court that barristers and solicitors would have attended that talk about the fact that King John will have sealed such a charter in 1215. So it seems unlikely that Shakespeare just didn't know that there was a charter sealed by John at that time. What's more likely is that Shakespeare just didn't view Magna Carta as being something that's very special, because when we look at those lecture series, it reminds us that these were a series of charters that have been issued by kings over time. Henry told us that there were iterations of this charter, and indeed we're celebrating the 1225 today. There would have been ones before John, and there were certainly ones after. And so in a sense, this charter just sits in a kind of constitutional trajectory that's much broader than that significant moment at Runnymede. What about the idea that it was too dangerous? Well, Shakespeare's no pushover. I don't know how many Shakespeare plays you might have read and come across, but he's pretty politically risky in a number of them. And indeed, there was a performance of Richard II on the eve of the Essex Rebellion in 1601. So he doesn't shy away from telling the kings and queens of the time the kind of more politically significant stories. That third idea, that plot device and it just not being very helpful. Well, in order to think about that, we need to think about what story Shakespeare might have been trying to tell us about King John. We have to remember in Tudor England, we have got the disruption caused by the divorce from Henry VIII to Queen Catherine of Aragon and his marriage to Anne Boleyn. This break with Rome caused and led to the construction of the Church of England. Now, King John, as Henry had told us, had also stood up to the Pope. He has seen as a big kind of hero because he stood up to Pope Innocent III. And it's this idea of John that Shakespeare tries to present in his play. The play is full of anti-popish sentiment, and so it seems likely that Shakespeare needed a strong king, a hero king, to stand up to Rome. A strong king doesn't need to be reminded of the rule of law. A strong king doesn't need to be held accountable by his barons. And so therefore Magna Carta in this version of the story just isn't as relevant. So let's fast forward to the 19th century and the idea that Magna Carta might have been a bit of an invention by the Victorians with respect to its constitutional significance. Throughout this century, the Charter has a tumultuous history politically, legally, and culturally. Politically, we see the Chartists using it in the 1830s and 50s as they start to call for political reform. Secret ballots, expanded voting rights, and electoral reforms are being demanded under the banner of this idea of the Charter. Now, despite that political usage, legally it's actually waning in significance. A number of reforms being brought through legislation are repealing sections of the Charter. But it is everywhere in the 19th century. There are mugs with it on, there are trinkets, you've got stained glass windows, there's statues of King John going up in the Houses of Parliament, cartoons, plaques. There's even a Madame Tussauds waxwork version of King John in 1890. And not only is it there culturally in the kind of the landscape, it's also there in these productions of Shakespeare's play, King John, in the 19th century, in the playbills, in the programmes, in the costumes. And indeed, theatre producers start putting it back into the performances. Something then must have changed. It's in the 19th century that King John becomes the tyrant that we all know and love from that Disney Robin Hood film. Walter Scott has written Ivanhoe, in which Prince John is the power-hungry younger brother of King Richard the Lionheart. He's there scheming away whilst King Richard is on the Crusades. And it's this evil version of King John that gets represented on the stages of London during this century. This kind of wicked, evil-minded tyrant. Now that scheming evil king needs a charter to bring him back in line. That's when we need to start to hold him accountable and remind him of the rule of law. So very briefly, there's also another theme that's going on as to why the Charter is being represented so widely culturally during this time, and that's to do with the kind of way in which British and national identity is being constructed in contrast to the French Revolution. The 19th century, at the start of which we're having the kind of response to the French Revolution. And we can see then that the British identity is being constructed as something much more constitutionally peaceful. We haven't needed a big revolution and a hasty redrafting of a constitution. And Magna Carta, as this ancient constitution that has lasted across time, is seen as being something that we can use as the national identity to distinguish ourselves from that revolutionary moment. And that nationalist fervour is seen again at the end of the 19th century when we look to the start of the Boer War. 1899 is a huge year for theatre with respect to King John. It happens to be the first Shakespeare play that's filmed as King John, although I'm sure many of us haven't even seen it. And there's a huge representation of the signing of the Charter that takes place. And audiences are encouraged to go and see this production for its representation of the great liberties at a moment in which British rationale for the Boer War is around the protection of civil rights, those civil rights being explicitly represented in that production. So when he was a hero, we didn't need a charter. But when he becomes the tyrant, that charter's needed to bring him into line. In summary then, the exhibition might be about a legal text or a charter, but the cultural significance is there as a web of political, legal, cultural representations that make up the constitutional significance. Thank you.
Ruth, thank you very much indeed. Our final contributor this afternoon is Dr. Ben Douglas. Ben is Associate Professor of Law here in Durham Law School. His research is particularly concerned with legal ethics, with human identity, and with human rights within the UK Constitution. Can we welcome our final speaker, Dr. Ben Douglas.
Hello. As the Dean Philip has said, I'm going to talk a bit about the current role of Magna Carta in the UK Constitution. So, as we've heard, there isn't really much of it left. There are 3 substantive clauses, and if you pretend you're Nicolas Cage in National Treasure and you look very, very closely, you'll find also the preamble, okay? But that's sort of be expected after about 800 years. Your average constitution around the world is about 30 years old. So the fact that this is still part of our constitution is significant, but the fact that a lot of it has changed is really to be expected. But even though there's only sort of 4 elements or 4 parts left, these are still important because within our constitution, so constitutions do 2 things. They are statements of the values of a society, and they are maps of power. Okay? Who has power, who can do what and to who, and what can't they do? And Magna Carta contains core statements of these values, which still resonate to these days. So first I'll talk about those values, and then I'll talk about its role as a map of power. So the first value we've heard about is the rule of law. Okay, so Clause 29 of the current Magna Carta that's still in the statute books. You can look it up on legislation.gov. I encourage you to do so. And that says, no free man shall be imprisoned, outlawed, executed, or otherwise destroyed, nor will we pass judgment upon him, but by the lawful judgment of his peers, or by the law of the land. We will sell to no man, we will not deny or defer to any man justice or right. Okay? And this is a statement that power will be exercised according to the law. Okay, the king can't just do whatever he wants. Okay, don't like that person, right? Execute them. No, he's saying, I can't do that anymore. I'm going to be subject to the law. Okay, and this still resonates to this day. If the government does something that you don't like, you can look to see whether the government has breached the law. Okay, you can bring an action for judicial review to review that government action. And if the government has breached the law, then that action will be declared invalid. Okay, so the first sort of value we find within Magna Carta that still resonates to this day is the rule of law. The second one is a statement that the law should be morally just. Okay, so Magna Carta states more than we should just obey the law. Okay, it says that the laws should be moral. So the preamble, and this is in the later version, okay, says, it's great, it's sort of in proper medieval language. It begins, know ye, okay, you can imagine the town crier or the dean saying that, know ye that we, unto the honour of Almighty God and for the salvation of the souls of our progenitors and successors as kings of England, to the advancement of the Holy Church and the amendment of our realm, of our mere free will, have given and granted to all of this realm these liberties following to be kept in our kingdom of England forever. Okay? So he's saying, yes, I'm stating all these rights, all these liberties, and it's not just because the barons have got my arm behind my back, it's because they are consistent with divine law, okay? They are morally right, okay? If you look at both the Henry version and the earlier King John version, they're a bit different, the preambles, and you can really see that John is really sort of saying this through gritted teeth. But in the Henry version, it's no, these are morally right things, and it's not just because I'm being forced to do this. Okay, so it's appropriate that the cathedral is a venue, okay, because to hold the Magna Cartas, because it's yeah, it's a statement of divine moral law and saying, yeah, the law must be morally right. But I think we must admit that religious belief isn't quite what it was in 1215, and God might or might not intervene to keep the government in line. So yes, but nonetheless, okay, that statement that the law should be moral continues to this day. It's the way in which Magna Carta has influenced the creation of various human rights documents. You can see it in the discussions in the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, of the European Convention on Human Rights, and the Human Rights Act. Okay, so this second value within Magna Carta, that the laws should be just, should be moral, also continues to this day. So first element of constitutional element is a statement of values. So the second one, the second constitutional role of Magna Carta is as a map of power, okay? It's a statement of who can do what and who can't do what, or what they can't do to people. And this is what most of Magna Carta is about, okay? The other two remaining provisions, the other two that are still in force, talk about the power of the church and the power of the City of London, okay? And it's the king saying, I'm going to respect the powers of these bodies, okay? And the other elements, they've been repealed as society's values have changed, okay? And as I say, that's to be expected. There's no real mention of democracy in Magna Carta, so it's a very good thing that sort of those elements have changed. And yeah, we have the Bill of Rights of sort of 1688, when Parliament gets a lot more power than it has under Magna Carta, okay? One thing that does endure from the early Magna Carta is the role of juries, okay? So juries are created, or at least sort of, they're wanted by the barons within Magna Carta because they want a semi-independent sort of source of judgment. They don't want the king to just be able to decide cases in his own interest. They want a jury to be able to sort of reflect, or to perhaps come to a more fairer decision, okay? And juries maintain to this day. So juries to this day are still an important check on power. You may have heard over the past few years, sometimes environmental protesters, that it's black and white, they have broken the law, okay? There's no two questions about it, and yet the jury acquits them, okay? And that is a right going back to Magna Carta. If the jury does not think that somebody should be prosecuted, if they think what actually they've done is right, then they have this right going back to Magna Carta to acquit them. So Magna Carta is still part of our map of power. So although there's not much left, it's important. And the UK Constitution it isn't just in one document. It isn't just in Magna Carta. It's often not clear what the Constitution says. We often have to go to court to find out. You might remember the Miller case during Brexit. Who has the power to take the UK out of the European Union? Is it Parliament or is it the government? And we weren't sure because the Constitution is sometimes unclear. And the court said, well, actually, it's Parliament. So, although Magna Carta, like the rest of the Constitution, can sometimes be unclear, I think the best way to think about it is to think about Magna Carta as like this another great sort of national monument, which is Stonehenge, okay? So Stonehenge is even more unclear than Magna Carta. Nobody knows why it was there. Was it a large sort of cheese storage structure? Was it where they held circuses? We don't know. But there's this great line by the archaeologist Barbara Bender, and she says, every generation gets the Magna Carta, not the Magna Carta, every generation gets the Stonehenge they desire or they deserve, okay? And she's sort of saying, well, yeah, and Magna Carta is like that, okay? It changes. So it wasn't until 1628 that torture was said to be unlawful under Magna Carta, okay? As society's values changed, the content of Magna Carta changed, okay? Magna Carta is rarely used in court these days, okay? Where it is used, where it's used properly or accurately, might be a better way of putting it, it's to back up claims of human rights, so right to a fair trial. So the court might say, well, this is protected by the Human Rights Act, but we can also trace it back to Magna Carta. The second sort of place you get sort of Magna Carta being used is by people who are desperate. Okay, these are people who have gone to court because they think something wrong is being done to them. They usually don't have legal advice because they either don't like the legal advice or they can't afford it. And they'll make a claim based on Magna Carta. And usually, almost universally, it would be said to be invalid, okay? But what this shows when these people use Magna Carta in this way is these two core values within Magna Carta. Power should be exercised in accordance with the law, and that law should reflect our moral values. And so we all have a role in defining Magna Carta's values. The question is, what sort of Magna Carta do we desire or do we deserve? Thank you.
Ross Nicholas, for the different insights you've given into Magna Carta in its creation, in its narrative, and its current use. So the questions really beautifully that explore all three aspects. Can we start with the question about history first of all? It maybe we turn to you, but panelists do chip in. We've got a question around the role of the barons, and a question about whether Magna Carta was actually just a piece of propaganda. Do you think it was, can you tell us about what it's something that the barons really forced on King John? Was it a piece of propaganda that was used in its day?
Yeah, propaganda's an interesting one. I might put that to one side for a second and think that the answer to the first question, was there something forced, is a straightforward yes. The context that's important is to understand that it was by then becoming the established practice that the new monarchs would issue a set of a Charter on Liberties. So demanding of the issue of a Charter of Liberties was a sort of reasonable, there was precedent. His brother, his father, his grandfather had all issued a Charter of Liberties that looked sort of like Magna Carta. The forcing was to get, there are some specific things in there. Towards the end, it named specific people who were to be released from prison, who were to have specific lands returned to them. So, there's things in there that make it very much about just what was forced on by the barons. As propaganda, I'm not sure. I guess once it's been released in sort of 1216 and 1217, maybe we are starting to think in terms of propaganda. That might be a useful term, because this was the guardians of the infant Henry III trying to say, he's legitimate, let's not have another war, we're going to, this is going to work. When he turns 18, or maybe 21, whatever they regarded as a majority, in 1225, and issues it in his own words and says, as Benedict highlighted, this is freely given. Then again, maybe it's about showing that this is sort of business as usual and this is normal.
Thank you. Another history question, maybe come back to you, and then we're going to expand it to its use today. How was Magna Carta enforced on kings in the medieval period, and what methods were used to make sure the king obeyed it?
War. The barons had literally occupied London. That's why it is signed in a field outside of London. I think the sort of the kind of East Midlands. So these are armies that have occupied parts of the kingdom. It's the threat of returning to warfare that causes the reintroduced in 1617. 25, you're probably still talking about the risk of war, but it had been previously. In terms of sort of forcing the king to submit to the rule of law, we don't have the king being put on trial, we don't have the king being arrested at those times. This is a sort of coming in a later period, but there is this recognition of not quite equality, but that the king should respond to that. Maybe something very briefly in the 1215 one, something that gets taken out is this council of barons that are going to force the king to abide by this. That's why it doesn't work, because he won't submit to that sort of authority, and that's taken out in 1216. So then this attempt to make the king literally have to obey a council of barons doesn't work. Is attempted, taken out. That looks something like the king being under law or under parliament, but
We'll come slightly closer to the current then, Ruth. I'm going to turn to you. It was something that Henry said, but you picked up effectively how has Magna Carta been used, how has it been understood, it's been understood in different ways. We've got a question about why did it take so long after the Magna Carta, which incorporated rudimentary women's rights, to bring meaningful rights to women?
Why indeed? That's a very good question, and I suspect a series of history books would be needed in order to answer why it took so long to bring about meaningful rights for women. It's worth mentioning that we're living through a time in which meaningful rights for women are being significantly chipped away and around the world. Speaking in particular about the United States of America.
Not my fault.
A kind of a backlash against reproductive justice for women. Now, in terms of flipping the question to something more meaningful perhaps, is the role of the Charter in the rights for women and the fight for rights for women. In that kind of later period of the 19th century into the 20th century, the suffragettes actually did turn again to the image of the Charter in their call for the right to vote. And we see there are kind of iconic posters or iconic images that are used by the suffragettes in their protest movement that refer to the Charter. Now, a lot of that kind of reference point, Chartists did a similar thing in the 1830s. They're not really referring to particular provisions. They're not reminding us, as Henry had, about the rights of women in the Charter. They're talking about the Charter in that more broader terms around freedoms and liberties and the need to extend that to women.
Could I just have one line? It's a point I was trying to make was that this isn't a story of kind of progression of rights, just that we all get more and more rights as history goes along, that there were a different set of rights, a different concept of rights at play there. If we look at the medieval condition or the condition of women in medieval times, even a serf, a peasantry woman, when her partner died, she had entitlement to inherit their share of the commons, to not be removed from her home. There were 80-something medieval guilds that were professions. Almost every single one of them had women members. Women took a lead in the medical profession, such as it was in the Middle Ages. There's all sorts of sources that say that only women can perform the caesarean cut. The involvement of women in childbirth was a respected profession. So it's not that there was a sort of growth of rights, there was a different condition of women in a very different social structure. And so, it changed, but it's interesting to note that there is a certain set of rights recognised there.
Thank you very much. Let's bring this up to the front page. That's where a lot of the questions are based about there. There's another question about the American president later on, so we're looking forward to that, which is, we'll work our way up to it. That later, Thom. So Ben, you framed Magna Carta and its impact on the world today. Can I ask a question that's been asked here? To what extent would the UK benefit from a contemporary Magna Carta movement? That is a new codified constitutional and societal contract that reflects modern Britain, thinking of those two roles of the state, the values and the map of power. Is the time now for a new Magna Carta? Yes. Right, don't say why.
Yes, I would say so, because if you think about its role as a map of power, okay, the Constitution as it stands at the moment is uncertain. Okay? There's a map, but very few people know what is on that map. Okay? And if the map is supposed to enable you to sort of state what your rights are, to hold a government to account, if you don't know what those rights are, okay, and they're not clear to you, then you're not really a citizen participating in power, you are a subject of power. Okay? And that is why I would say a written constitution would be a good idea, because it would move us further from being subjects towards being citizens, because we would know what that power is. The hard part is getting to writing a constitution. Saying we should have a written constitution is the easy bit. The hard bit is, how do we come together as a country to create such a constitution?
Thom. So that's absolutely right. The other part is amending the written constitution. So it's often said that my native country has one of the world's greatest 18th century constitutions. Only problem is with the 21st century. So written perfectly for a certain age and a certain time. But there's this issue about setting it out clearly and then how do you revise that over time. It's also I agree.
There's a question around, therefore, to put some specifics, that the government is now considering non-jury trials for some common offences. Does the Magna Carta give us a lens through which to look at that question, or are other resources ones that we should turn to? Shall I start? I don't mind very much.
So the role of jury trials has changed very much over time. So it's not unusual for sort of the amount of jury trials to change over history. That's something that's happened in the past. The question of whether that's a good idea now, it's again the question of, well, what does that do for justice, the values of our society, and the balance of power?
When I first came to the UK in 2001, shortly before 9/11, it was a year or two later when Jack Straw, I think, was Justice Secretary, and was proposing curtailing some uses of jury trial, significant whatever it was. And it was something that I found kind of strange, in the sense that, where I came from, it seemed to be a kind of a God-given right. And I think that's the influence of Magna Carta. There was something very, very special and fundamental about this right. And maybe think a bit more about it. I mean, the current situation, it seems to be about expediency. That to do a jury trial is kind of expensive. Expensive not just in terms of money, in terms of time. You get people in place. You need to have alternative jurors in case someone falls ill or can't make it through the day. They don't usually serve just for an hour or two. They'll be there every week. They'll do more than one case here. And so then to have the trials of real significance, and I think it's important that we think about kind of more minor things, people getting into trouble over small bits of criminal damage that might be a magistrate's court, no jury trial. Things that something more significant, assault, battery, might not require, might not be a criminal court kind of thing. But for the more serious things, of murder and offenses like that with people on trial, these are typically always jury trials where people have that option of a jury trial. It's interesting that historically we've had a place where the most serious offenses for which we can be tried will be ones that we typically have juries. Now the issue for the government seems to be expediency. It's difficult getting people in a room. There's been a big backlog since COVID of getting people in place. A lot of the courtrooms have been sold off. Have a jury, to have a trial is more difficult, and so on and so forth. So it seems to be kind of a raw expediency. I think looking back to Magna Carta, it wasn't about expediency. It wasn't about doing swift justice. It was about kind of, use what Ben was saying, kind of doing justice with a capital J, in a sense of kind of doing the right thing. I'm just going to add one final point on top of it. One of my favorite philosophers, not mine, mine's Hegel. And Hegel has a comment in favor of jury trial, which is this, that often the law is a technical language. What's set out is, Magna Carta is Latin. Unless you can read the language of the law, you can't know or exercise properly the defense of your rights. You can't speak that language. If we didn't, for Hegel, 19th century German philosopher, if we did not have a jury of our peers, if the running of a court was run only by legal professionals who are accredited, who recognize each other, and so on and so forth, whether I have a charge to answer for, what the evidence is, what its weight or lack of, whether, the grounds of my being convicted or let go. This is a play, an act that only certain people have access to and not myself. And if we are to ensure that you and I, can be aware of why we have a call to answer for, why we're there, what the evidence is, does it count, and the grounds for whether or not we are imprisoned or not. The only real guarantee, other than swearing out, would be having a jury trial. So I have a lot of concerns personally about this kind of curtailing jury trial. Even though it happens very rarely, 91% of the time in the United States, no jury trial. 96% of the time England, no jury trial. 98% in Scotland, no jury trials. They don't happen as often as you might think.
Yeah, I would just add one thing that, yeah, it's not just Jerusalem is a small part of it, and there's a wider problem with the lack of funding for the legal system, legal aid is very limited. And I think that's much more than jury trials is the thing that limits justice in the UK. When I see people at citizens' advice, they might have a good legal case, but they're not going to be able to afford a lawyer, and so they might not get justice. And I think that's as big a problem.
Thank you. So, the most popular question is from Nick, who asked this question. Considering the role of Magna Carta in American lawmaking you described, can you comment on the current President's approach to law and civil liberties? It may be that Ruth wants to, because Ruth picked up on that as well, in terms of, we want to expand it and say, how would you see, picking up what Ruth pointed out, how would you see the general sphere across the developed world in which the Magna Carta and its respective individual liberties has been eroded or developed?
Wow. People used to ask me, why do you leave America? They don't ask me that anymore. That's the right response, everyone. So, one thing to say about American history is that it's a bit of a... So while the governing positions of most of, some of the original colonies were from England, and a lot of the folks came from England, Scotland, in early America. There were a lot of folks who are from other countries. The main national group in each of the different places would surprise a lot of people. Nonetheless, the legal system recorded was 100% from England. And it was the case as the Americans were drawing up what are the rules around here, that these either trained by English lawyers or English lawyers themselves looked into Blackstone. So if you couldn't find a rule in the early American statute, we looked to Blackstone, and sometimes are back to Magna Carta as a there. What's kind of strange in a way in the moment, looking kind of some of these things to the president and all, and to Ruth, is in the United States there is a kind of a veneration of founding fathers, a veneration of their Constitution, whatever that is, and all its iterations, etc., with multiple interpretations of all of the above. And it kind of clear, whatever one is trying to do, harking back to that moment that I am acting in the guise of what the lawyers would describe as the federalist side, or the anti-federalist side, or so on and so forth. But for everyday people, harking back to those folks at the original Constitution Convention and making that case. And I'm either proud or not. I've got no idea why he did what he did. But one of my direct ancestors was at the Connecticut State Constitution to ratify the U.S. Constitution. And all we know about my ancestor was he said no. And that's very weird because Roger Sherman was from Connecticut, selling the Connecticut Compromise that won the votes across. It is their constitutional arrangement now. My ancestor would have known him and thought he was full of it. But what's different about Trump at the moment and the current administration is this veneration thing is gone. That's not necessarily a bad thing, because there's this veneration can with uncritically can lead into a lot of problematic spaces. But it's what is the plan? I think there's a lack of direction, at least when people spoke about, I'm harping back to James Madison or Thomas Jefferson or other people, I knew what direction we were going in. And now I think we're not so sure.
Thank you. I guess one of the questions there that you have is about whether there's other sources that we could be looking to, which I guess raises the question of why do we keep looking back to Magna Carta and that kind of nostalgia for these kind of foundational liberties. And I guess that goes to something that I was trying to demonstrate is that, and Ben kind of iterated, is that we make the Charter something that we want in the present moment for the political, cultural moment. This kind of reiteration of Magna Carta now as something that is an ancient constitutional constitutional text is something that is definitively English, British, in this moment in which we're seeing a turn away from the European Convention on Human Rights as something which has been imposed on us in some way from the Europe. And so we need to find a kind of British or English foundational text to turn to. I think that is similar to the way in which the 19th century were also constructing a British identity around ideas of these foundational charters. And so in celebrating or in venerating these kind of constitutional texts, I think we also have to ask ourselves what the kind of the political motive is behind looking back to some of these old documents.
So can I pick you up, and maybe this is a question for all four of you want to answer by way of coming into land, therefore, which is, do you think that Magna Carta is more relevant? What is the relevance of Magna Carta today? Do you think it's relevant? Is it growing? Is it declining? I'm interested in the views. That's a question that was being asked and quite popular among us. What's the relevance of Magna Carta? Is it growing, declining, and why? Tom? Henry, Tom?
I think its relevance could improve. I think something that wasn't said in the discussion about constitution is that constitutions are almost always a product of a civil war, a peace settlement, of a revolution. And there is something, I would say, that we can recover a revolutionary potential in Magna Carta, particularly when we look at it alongside its smaller forest charter. And so that story can be told. That the Magna Carta has this potential. It talks about basic rights, fundamental rights, but it mainly talks about in the language that we're not familiar with, rights to food, rights to warmth, rights to safety, rather than rights to vote or to have a child by jury.
I think one way it's relevant is, I think we're a place in search of glue. We have issues of social cohesion that are a real factor, and that since Magna Carta, a lot of things have happened. One of them is that there was an empire stretching around the world. The sun didn't set on it, and some of us, like me, from those old colonies, have come back. It's in fact, I'm an immigration law person. Most of the nationalities that come to the UK now are people who come from what was once part of this empire, and less than 100 years ago would have had equal rights, would have got the same passport as citizens of the UK colonies that anyone born here would have had, and so on. I think we're at this time of division in our communities across the country. It's not unique to the UK. It's not unique to here. But looking for those things that bring us together. What's interesting in a way about the idea of Magna Carta, and maybe this is a gloss on what's its significance and relevance now, is it's a sense of that we are glued together wherever we are, wherever we come from, whatever barony you happen to occupy, and so on and so forth. We're tied together by our shared liberties and our commitment to a rule of law that binds us all. This openness to difference from wherever we are. Something that began to soon unite the folks not just across what became modern England, but also Wales and the rest of this country. And that sense of looking for glue that connects us to our liberties, commitment to a common rule book, as it were, and not to other aspects of ourselves that might be influenced there. I think it's not just interesting, but I think timely and constructive.
Yeah, I guess I'd add warning to what has been said in that we can't rely solely on that text or the text of law alone. I think as we've seen the usage of Magna Carta throughout history, it waxes and wanes, and its significance will change with respect to what our political motives are. We saw a massive celebration of Magna Carta in 2015 through the government, sort of celebrating it, and that's all kind of something that we need to remember. It was part of political performance, shall we say. And so I would just add caution that as a community, as a society, we can't be relying on these pieces of paper alone to form that view. Because those texts can be amended, lost, and maybe not.
There's the question, what's the Magna Carta now?
The question is Magna Carta still relevant to London or less?
It is still relevant. We're all here because... Oh, sorry. It is still relevant. As all being here is perhaps proof of that. But what it needs to be redefined by each generation. And I think we need to think about those values that we have in common, that we have as human beings. Because ultimately, that's how I interpret Magna Carta. But yeah, we've come a long way in the last 800 years. And we should protect a lot more than we did then.
Perhaps a final question. A number of you commented on the particular, I think you, Henry, spoke about the fact that religious law was dominant at the time. We're in a place of worship, and the Magna Carta has been displayed in our museum, and we've had people praying for the things that have come out of Magna Carta in the chapter house. Somebody asked the question, can religious laws ever equal or overrule the common rule of law? That's the relationship between religious law and common law in the world today. If you want to have a go at that.
I'll start to think, again, the reason why it's in the cathedral is thinking about what the role of the church then. It's, as Thom commented, it's written in Latin, it's distributed, it was being read aloud. The church was a place where you could be informed of what the law was. So that separation of religious law and everyday law was not a thing. Like the place where you found out what the new rules were, what the new king had said, was in the church. And so I think that's something that's to understand the kind of the closeness of the relationship. It's hard to access what it means. For example, another thing that happens in 1250 is Pope Innocent III tries, is the first attempt to try and put a stop to trial by ordeal by banning churches from authorising it. So the idea that guilt or innocence would be directly decided by God through an ordeal, and how you survive or how you cope with that ordeal. So the influence of religion and law, or religion and justice was very directly connected. It was a very everyday experience. So I don't think
yeah, the relationship between religious law and common law. Yes, I think religious law still speaks to common law, but so does every morality. And we must always answer is this law moral? It's a vital question. Yeah, so it's not just there is always this question, always this relationship between religious and other law, but it's between widely non-religious as well. Yeah, always answer that question.
Colleagues, I want to, on your behalf, to say thank you to our contributors. We've been given a remarkable overview, and certainly my impression listening to our contributors has been that Magna Carta has come alive to me as a document that not only is of historical significance, but of considerable cultural and legal relevance today. Thom, you very capably and eloquently explained the context of Magna Carta as a founding document, but one had significance not only for the UK, but for the US. You described it as something that has the potential to be the glue that holds us all together. Henry, you so capably took us back to the world of the 13th century and to the way in which 1215 Magna Carta was the result of strife between John and his barons, and indeed the Pope as well. But you also showed the way in which the material, economic and social rights were firmly embedded, including some surprising rights from the 13th century around women's rights, and took us fascinatingly into the world of fish weirs and their relevance for the everyday life of people. Ruth, you gave a tour de force in explaining that Magna Carta, it has been lost and rediscovered over the years.
You took us into the world of Shakespeare, as well as the world of the 19th century, and showed us the way in which Magna Carta has been used and indeed abused by people who have wanted to create their own narratives for their own use. When we wanted a tyrant, we found him in King John, and wasn't he useful? And then you've explained the way in which constitutions are, for which Magna Carta is perhaps a first fruits, as a statement of values and of lack of power. And you've shown the way in which Magna Carta created some of the questions that we have to engage with today. But I think what's been so impressive is that you've shown us that Magna Carta frames a series of questions with which we need to engage. And while it may be a resource in a time of a need for social cohesion, it also asks demanding questions of us about whether we're prepared to explore our own motives about why we want those social cohesions. And in this place, the cathedral, it invites us to recognise that nobody is above the law. And indeed, one of the great things I find as I read the scriptures, the Old and New Testament, is the Bible is full of really fairly nasty leaders who are held to account. I love the story of Nathan, who goes to King David, who's broken about 6 of the 10 commandments in one afternoon. And Nathan is the prophet who says, you have done wrong and you will be held to account. It's no bad note on which to end, to realise that presidents, kings, and all of us are accountable in some way or another. But you've given us much food to think about and to reflect on. Can we thank our contributors for their outstanding contribution this afternoon? And I want to say thank you very much to all of you for coming. This afternoon has been recorded and it will be available on the Durham Cathedral website. We have a YouTube channel, and do go and look at that. It will be available fairly soon. And there are also recordings of previous Durham Cathedral Institute events. It is still possible today to visit Magna Carta. It closes at 4 o'clock, but if you'd like to go and visit Magna Carta and you haven't seen it yet, please go to the back of the church and buy a ticket from the visitor desk, and we'd be delighted to have you. Thank you for coming to this Durham Cathedral Institute event. We'll be hosting a new series of events in 2026. We'll make details of those available on our social media channels. But have a good, safe journey home. Thank you for coming, and God bless.